Psalm 88, like all the Psalms, depends on the lenses you bring to the reading of it. And I'm going to share that for me, Psalm 88 is written about clinical depression, the extreme of darkness. But for others, depending on the lens, it's a psalm about the pain of exile. So I want to begin, even before I read the psalm, which I'll do shortly, with an example of Art Scroll's introduction to Psalm 88. And again, this traditional orientation is seeing these painful words as spoken on behalf of the community. Israel's exile and dispersion were divinely ordained as instruments to spur Israel's spiritual development in the pursuit of excellence. In exile, the lonely, insecure Jew is compelled to turn to a divine source of strength in order to find security and a purpose for his life. The exile is exceptionally close to God, for no secular national loyalties interfere with his devotion to God. Ideally, the holiness of Eretz Israel should have brought the people to heightened perceptions of God and to fulfill their spiritual potential. But instead of utilizing the land to enhance their development, they allowed themselves to become creatures of the earth. Therefore, they were exiled so that they would realize that their home is the Torah, not a parcel of real estate, and their success depends on mitzvot, not on a plow. So the introduction from a traditional perspective, you see, is about suffering, it's about exile, it's about the community. And yet, the other lens, and the lens that I am identified with, is this psalmist who's clearly in deep pain. This is the darkest of all the psalms. With further ado, let me pull up the psalm and read it with you, acknowledging that this particular psalm is a little bit different in its construction. Psalms, to emphasize a point, usually engage in the repetition of words. But in this case, and there are a few of those repeated words, in this case, it's largely the use of synonyms, 6 different synonyms for death, many synonyms for terror or trouble, and it's the use of different kinds of synonyms that convey the core message. With that, Psalm 88 and the title taken from a phrase in the psalm, "Your horrors destroy me." A psalm of the descendants of Korach for the conductor upon Machalat La'anot, a maskil of Heman the Ezrachite. Adonai, God of my deliverance, by day I cried out, by night in front of you. Let come before your face my prayer. Incline your ear to my ringing cry. For sated with troubles is my spirit, and my life to Sheol has reached. I am considered with those that go down into the pit. I've become as a person who has no strength. Among the dead, freed as the slain who lie in the grave, who are not remembered anymore, and from your hand they are cut off. You have placed me into the pit's bottom, into total darkness, into a shadowy chasm. Upon me weighs your wrath, and with all your crashing waves you cause affliction. Selah. You have distanced my intimate friends from me. You make me a total abomination to them. I am imprisoned and cannot get out. My eyes grow weak from my affliction. I call upon you, Adonai, every day. I spread toward you my palms. For the dead will you work wonders? Will departed spirits rise to praise you, Selah? Will it be told in the grave of your kindness or your faithfulness in Avadon? Will it be known in the darkness, your wonders, and your justice in the land of oblivion? But as for me, to you, Adonai, I wail, and in the morning my prayer will greet you. Why, Adonai, do you spurn my spirit? Do you hide your face from me? Afflicted am I and expiring. From my youth I have carried your terrors, which preoccupy me. Upon me has passed your fierce wrath. Your horrors destroy me. They surround me like waters all the day. They encircle me all together. You have distance from me, lover and friend. From my intimate friends, darkness. Now, in translating this, there's a lot of cause for choice. And that's also in terms of punctuation. For in Hebrew, the Hebrew comes without punctuation. And in this case, a number of obscure terms. So now I'll go back through it, but I want to highlight that one of the things that fascinates me is finding the bullseye. What are the middle words of a psalm that often define the core feeling and message? In this case, the middle words of the psalm, that's word 71 and 72, is kalu velo etze. I am imprisoned and cannot get out. That's at the very center of this 19-verse psalm, but in word count, that's the center. Kalu velo etze. I'm imprisoned and cannot get out. Well, what gives this psalmist this feeling of being imprisoned? The commentators say that it could be a physical illness like leprosy, which could isolate the psalmist from those around him. In fact, there's an obscure word in verse 6, b'metim chofshi, among the dead. I translate it as chofshi kamo chalalim, freed as the slain. But the word chofshi is also used in 2 Kings 15, verse 5, to be the place of lepers. Beit chufshiyut is the place that lepers have been isolated. And so instead of freed, it can be isolated as the slain who lie in the grave. And so back to what's the nature, and that's part of the ambiguity in the poetry of a poem of this psalm, is this phrase in the beginning for the conductor. I'll pause to say lemenatzeach itself. Sometimes I choose to translate it as conductor. It can be the leader. It can be the lead musician. It's unclear in its necessary significance. But the next phrase, al machalat la'anot, one of the commentators, Meiri, a medieval commentator, will say that machalat la'anot, which literally means the illness for affliction, here the Meiri will say, the Meiri lived in Spain, 1249 to 1315, that it was the kind of instrument, sound, that had a quality that evoked tears, tears that would lead to repentance. Others say it's actually a description of the context of the psalm, that it deals either with illness, machala, or mechila. Mechila means forgiveness, same root as machala, as illness. So it can also be understood as forgiveness for a note. And a note can be affliction, but it can also be for answering. And in that regard, Adin Steinsaltz, the contemporary translator of the Talmud, says that this particular psalm was done antiphonally with two groups, one answering the other, which again, just to circle Machalat La'anot, we're not sure. Haman, the Ezrachite, we know who he is in the Bible. He's mentioned in First Chronicles several times as a sage, as a leader of the temple music, and he's one of four in First Chronicles 2, verse 6, where the second son of a man identified as an Ezrachite will be the author of tomorrow's psalm. All right, but I want to move now into the substance. That's just to acknowledge that there is some ambiguity. Adonai, God of my deliverance, by day I cried out, by night in front of you. So here, the psalmist, perhaps with leprosy, some physical malady, or perhaps in deep emotional depression, says that I call out to you, God. Benjamin Siegel, a contemporary commentator on this psalm, says this might be said to God tauntingly or even ironically. But the other way to read this opening line, the way I prefer to read it, is context. I mean, the paradox of this psalm, here's a person who feels isolated, cut off from friends. We'll come back to why he feels and how that is experienced, but he still has a context for prayer. And the word prayer will be repeated in this psalm. And in that sense, the psalmist, although feeling worthless, perhaps as seen in the eyes of others, cut off, still calls out to God by day, crying out, Yeshuati, and Sa'akati. The word Sa'akati, here cried out, is used in the Bible. For instance, Moses at the shores of the Reed Sea, Sa'ak calls out, and that's interpreted as prayed out. So I cry out during day, I pray at night. That here, the word tefillah with the cry in verse 2, and verse 3, prayer, calling on God, let come before you your face, my prayer. Lefanecha literally means your face, and that's a quality of immediacy. Incline your ear. And again, this anthropomorphism, which we find throughout, where God is a relationship giving human-like physicality to my ringing cry. And here's again a word with multivalence. The word rina, verse 3, the last word, usually is song. And some of the translators will translate it as incline your ear to my song. But clearly this is pain. And rina also implies rejoicing usually. This is the rare case where rinati has this quality of uncertainty where I'm calling out to you with a ringing cry. There's a sense of musicality, the ringing. That's a translation I borrowed from Richard Levy, again a contemporary translator, that made sense to me. For sated with troubles is my spirit. And sated, sava, is also usually understood in a positive sense and can be understood as saturated. I can't take any more. I am saturated with ra'ot. Ra'ot can be troubles, it can be evil, it can be badness. I am overwhelmed. My life to Sheol. Sheol is one of the key words, probably the key words for the place of the afterlife. It first appears when Jacob says, upon learning of Joseph's death, of his going to Sheol, he will die in mourning. Some translate this as my life to the brink of Sheol, and there's ambiguity, has reached. He feels himself, and that'll segue, on the cusp of death. I am considered with those that go down into the pit. Bore, another one of those synonyms for either the grave or the afterlife. I have become, as a person, Ein Eyal, who has no strength, among the dead. So he sees himself as if dead, which again, for Adin Steinsaltz, will add in his translation the comment that is what gives him. He writes as follows, Adin Steinsaltz: "Since I feel dead already, I cannot help but wonder." Among the dead, freed as the slain who lie in the grave, freed is also understood. I mentioned the leper, but freed from all sense of being alive, freed from responsibilities, let go, who are not remembered anymore, and from your hand they are cut off. And that opens up to a theme that I won't address today, but I did in my letter, and that is Jewish views of the afterlife. And does God have a relationship post-death? In Psalms, repeatedly and consistently, it appears not. And I shared some of those sites. "You have placed me into the pit's bottom, into total darkness, into the shadowy chasm." "Upon me weighs your wrath, and with all your crashing waves you cause affliction." Selah. And we have learned that the word Selah seems to be a musical notation for a pause. It's included by the Masoretes, the scribes, hundreds, even as much as 1,000 years after a psalm is written. The Brandeis teacher of Bible, as I've mentioned, Nachum Sarna, sees that it's related to sal, a basket, so that it's a boom, a sense of cutting, marking a end of a section. "Upon me weighs your wrath, with all your crashing waves you cause affliction." And you get the sense of drowning, of being really overwhelmed. And now isolation. "You have distanced my intimate friends from me." And here's another word that has many different translations, and that's the word yidai. It can mean those who know me, literally, but also that is sometimes translated as acquaintances. But we read that Adam yada et Chava ishto. Adam knew Eve, his wife, and the rabbis will say there the word yada is sexual. It's an intimate knowing. And for me, I chose Richard Levy as another translator who used the word intimate. I chose intimate friend because rather than an acquaintance, somebody who simply knows him, to emphasize his pain. "You have distanced my intimate friends from me. You make me a total abomination to them. I am imprisoned and cannot get out." That's the middle of the psalm. What is that experience? That's the experience of deep isolation and even self-loathing. You make me a total abomination to them. You know, when the Israelites are sent out as scouts into the land to see if they can conquer it, they say, "We were like grasshoppers in their eyes, and so were we in ours." And the rabbis comment, there's no way they could have known how they were perceived in the eyes of the other. That they say they saw them as grasshoppers is simply projection. And so "you make me a total abomination to them." That's my free association here. And a comment. I did write a book in honor of turning 50 about being a mental patient. I was hospitalized in 3 mental hospitals on the cusp of suicidal ideation. And in honor of turning 50, which was over 20 years later, I wrote about it, prompted by the suicide of a rabbinic friend. And I sought to normalize despair as part of life, acknowledging that even many of our great leaders, Moses, Churchill, to go to Manchester for Irene, Lincoln in America, talked about their deep despair and depression. I want to emphasize, all the more having written this book and having taught about depression, there is a difference between the blues, which everybody has experiences with, and on the continuum, when you cross a line into clinical depression, where you feel yourself spiraling down and there is no way out. In deep depression, you feel boxed in. You are self-loathing and you see yourself as worthy, or I should say, lacking any worthiness in the eyes of others. That quality of that deep and dangerous despair is what I feel in this middle verse. You have distanced my intimate friends from me. I'm now isolated. You make me a total abomination to them. That's how I see myself. I am imprisoned and cannot get out. I see no hope because there's no way out. And therefore, that will lead to a series of questions. Verse 10 and 11 are another little segment. Verses 9, 10, and 11. My eyes grow weak from my affliction. I call upon you, Adonai, every day. I spread toward you my palms. That's a gesture of prayer. So although he is isolated, although he is in pain, he's still, and that's the context for the psalm and the paradox of the psalm, prays, turns to God. For the dead, will you work wonders? Will departed spirits rise to praise you? The end of this little segment with the word Selah, you hear the drum, and it's a bridge to a whole series of questions which reveal what the psalmist sees as what God really wants. And so the bridge is saying, for the dead will you work wonders, will departed spirits rise to praise you. And as we've seen, I circled the word yaducha, praise you, as the psalmist repeatedly identifies purpose in Psalms. It's to sing God's praises, to acknowledge God's wonders. And now a series of rhetorical questions. Will it be told in the grave of your kindness, of your faithfulness in Adonai, implying that what the purpose of life is to acknowledge God's kindness, to acknowledge God's faithfulness. And here another synonym for the grave or for the afterlife, avadon, which literally means that which is lost. Will it be known in the darkness your wonders and your justice in the land of oblivion, nishiyah, another synonym. But as for me, and here again, he's turning to God. To you, Adonai, I wail in the morning, my prayer will greet you. Meaning, even though I feel isolated, I still am engaged in the rhythm of my prayers. I'm reminded of Elie Wiesel's stories that in Auschwitz, after putting God on trial and finding God guilty for abandoning his people, they will then daven Mariv, the evening prayers, because that's the rhythm. And here, why, Adonai, do you spurn my spirit? Do you hide your face from me? And you can see that's a quality of the prayer. It's not necessarily only the rhythm of prayer. It's the notion that God is there to hear our longings, our pain. And the pain continues until the end of the song. Afflicted am I and expiring. From my youth I have carried your terrors, which preoccupy me. The word afunah is one of those Hebrew uncertain terms, some translated as turn to them, benumbed, without recourse, Jewish Publication Society, wherever I turn. But wherever I turn, there's this notion of preoccupation. In my deep depression, it was like going around in a circle. I was so self-involved with my self-chastisement that I couldn't see beyond myself. And that's my way of understanding here the psalmist. Afflicted am I and expiring. From my youth I have carried your terrors, which preoccupy me. Upon me has passed your fierce wrath. Your horrors destroy me. Nothing is more painful than that self-flagellation. They surround me like waters all the day, and you can feel almost this experience of drowning. They encircle me altogether. You have distanced from me, Ohev v're'ah, lover and friend. Some others translate it as friend and neighbor. From my intimate friends. Let me read you some different translations of this last line and then pull it together. You have distanced from me, lover and friend. From my intimate friends, darkness. King James Version, you have, from my intimate friends, darkness translates my acquaintance into darkness. JPS, out of my sight. The New International Version, a Protestant translation, you have taken my companions and loved ones from me. The darkness is my closest friend. Or Adin Steinsaltz, a different understanding of that last phrase, those who know me are in darkness. What is clear to pull this together is this psalm is dark. That's the closing word. The frame of this psalm, if you look at this last section in verse 9 and in verse 19, are the words, the same words, Hirchakti miyadai, you have distanced my intimate friends. That's the last chunk of this, and the closing, that's an inclusio, and the other inclusio is the words of and well, I'll leave that as the inclusio. Hirchakti mimeni miyadai, you have distanced from me those who are my intimate friends. There are some interesting word plays to point out and some other uncertainties of words. I'll leave that to your comments and reactions. I'll just say a closing word for you to react, and that is, I am drawn to the honesty that Psalms permit. To express deep emotional pain can provide catharsis, clarity, and even connection. That's why we need a therapist at times. And even more, a psalm are words to God. God who knows us, God who's not going to tell our secrets, and therefore a quality of unbridled self-expression. That honest expression in this psalm is filled with pain of isolation and yet longing for God, with the awareness that life is about acknowledging God's wonders and being able to sing God's praises. With that, I stop the share so that I can welcome everybody. Nice to see some familiar faces from far and wide joining in the wonders of Zoom. So, Psalm 88, what are some thoughts or reactions that this psalm might have prompted for you? Julia?
Can you say more about why this is called a maskil, why it's being connected with wisdom? Is it, and if so, like what part, would it be more in the Job, Kohelet side of wisdom? How do you place that claim here?
So at the beginning of this psalm, to give context to Julia's question, it says, Maskil leHeman ha'ezrachi, that this psalm is a maskil of Heman the Ezrachite. We've seen this word as part of the introduction for other psalms, and maskil means a teaching of wisdom. And it's related, as Julia notes, to wisdom literature like the book of Job, which is seen as a wisdom literature. And you get those qualities here, and you'll see it again tomorrow, of echoes of Job and Job's suffering. Remember, back to the image of leprosy, two comments about leprosy. You know, leprosy is the only medical condition described in the Bible. And I once asked a historian of medicine why he thought that was the case. And he said, because in an ancient world, when you had leprosy, it was as if you looked like your skin was falling off. You looked like you were dying, but unlike other medical ailments, you could continue, you could survive with it. And so, for Job, Job has something like leprosy as well. He breaks out his skin in all kinds of hives. That's the free association. But what is fascinating, to pull together Julia's question and the answer, is that this psalm was seen as wisdom, that even in deep pain, there was a voice that was worthy of being heard, that there was an honesty that was a wisdom. And so beyond that, we're only left to speculate why this is linked to other things that are called wisdom literature, like Job. Shula, Cantor Shula, you have to unmute.
Okay, unmute. I sort of got stuck at verse 3, not liking very much the fact that we're taking Larinati and saying that it's a ringing cry.
Yeah.
As we got later into the psalm, we saw various examples that the particular poet here does use synonyms. And I would rather, and since we are more or less theorizing, speculating, and interpreting, I kind of see Larinati more as a kind of synonymous word to tfilati, saying, you know, I'm giving you prayer, I'm giving you the usual song that goes with prayer, but boy, God, I have had it. You know, sav'avera ot nafshi, I can't do anymore. I'm giving you the best that I am. By the way, tavo lefanecha is a beautiful phrase from also High Holiday prayers, and so on. So I am choosing to believe that tfilati and rinati here may be more synonymous than anything else.
Thank you, Shula. So as a prayer leader, Cantor Shula is sensitive to this use of the word of rinati. Let me again give context. Verse 3, let my prayer come before your face. Incline your ear to my ringing cry. And what Shula points out is there's often, you know, part A and part B are parallels in some verses, and my prayer might be synonymous with my song, and therefore it can literally be my song, which is the way it's normally understood, as to say, I'm giving you my prayers, my best songs, and yet I'm only getting trouble in exchange. And so Shula's comfortable leaving it as song, its normal use, and that's the tension. Most translators, though, do see it as, some will just say it as a cry, because that's the context. And often Hebrew words, the vocabulary is much smaller, for instance, than in English, have therefore multiple possibilities. And sometimes a prayer can also be a cry. Just like I mentioned with the image of Moses at the Reed Sea shouting out to God, sa'akati, another word used here in this psalm, their shouting out is understood as prayer also. Another comment? Mimi? You have to unmute, Mimi.
Yes, I just unmuted. in verse 6, I mean, the whole psalm has a lot of difficult images. But the thing that really stood out to me is that among the dead who are not remembered anymore.
Yes.
And I think particularly at this time, the idea that someone isn't remembered is horrible to me.
It is. And a couple of thoughts in response to that, Mimi. So again, verse 6, among the dead, freed as the slain who lie in the grave, who are not remembered anymore, and from your hand they are cut off. So that quality of being no longer remembered for somebody who's alive is the, kind of an ultimate sense of purposelessness and aloneness, isolation. It's isolation from those you care about no longer remembering you. And it's not clear, again, the power of poetry, if he's not remembered by the people who are his friends or remembered by God. That's ambiguous and potentially both. And yes, that is a deep expression of fear and pain. The sense that I feel like I am among the dead who is no longer remembered. But by implication, you have the question, is that how it is for the dead? Nobody remembers them? Because again, the hope is that they are remembered. So Rabbi Podwal, a comment, and then I'll pull it together. Go ahead, Rabbi Podwal.
As we pointed out here, this psalm, of course, is a cry from the depths, but at least the person can cry out. And this psalm brings to mind Aaron, and when his two sons suddenly died, Aaron, Moses' brother, where he could not cry out. He did not cry out. And it's so unnatural that he couldn't outwardly, God didn't give him an opportunity to outwardly mourn or pour forth what he felt in his heart. And you mentioned before, well, sometimes you need a therapist. Well, poor Aaron, I think, needed a therapist after that, because God did not allow him to mourn.
Yeah. So the Torah will say regarding Aaron, when his two sons bring an offering with strange fire and are zapped at the beginning of, the inauguration of the altar, it says, Vayidom Aharon, and Aaron was dumbstruck. And so Rabbi Podwal points out that there's maybe only one thing worse than this quality of pain, and that is absolute silence, the inability to even speak. Here, the saving grace is that the psalmist has words and an audience, God. And here, that's the paradox, to pull this together. The paradox is somebody who feels on the cusp of death, isolated, darkness, that word gets repeated throughout. In fact, in verse 7, uniquely, verse 7, you have placed me into the pit's bottom, into total darkness. I translate total darkness because darkness is in the plural in verse 7. So it's like total. And yet, despite that, there's an outlet. So in contrast, as Rabbi Podwal notes, of Aaron at his lowest point being left speechless, here there is relationship and thereby hope. I shared at the outset in reading the introduction for the Art Scroll that this psalm was read by Jews in exile for 2,000 years as their communal expression of pain, of feeling isolated, cut off even from God, and yet being able to call out to God. We don't know who wrote it or when it was written, and like great poetry, like a religious poem, it can be read as a personal or a communal expression. I found this poem deeply resonant, and yet that thread of light in that there is God here to call out to. With that, I'm going to have Kaddish and then a closing word by Rochelle Ampersand. Kaddish allows for us to honor through study the memory of loved ones. If there's anybody who has a Kaddish to recite, please join together. Yitkadal v'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah Alma Dibra Kirutei Yamlich Malchutei B'chayechon Uvyomechon Uvchaye Dechol Beit Yisrael Ba'agala Uvizman Karim Iru Amen. Yehi Shmei Rafa Mevarach Leolam Leomaya Yitbarach V'yishtabach V'yitba'ar V'yitromam V'yitnaseh V'yitadar V'yitalet V'yitalal Shemei Dekudshah B'richu Le'elah Mikol Birchata V'shirata Tushbachata V'nechemata Amiran V'yoma V'yuamein
Amen.
Yehi Shlama Rabba Min Shemaya V'chayim Aleinu V'Kol Yisrael V'imru Amen.
Amen.
Osei Shalom Yomav Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu V'Kol Yisrael V'Kol Yoshvei Tevel V'imru Amen.
Amen.
It's a treat to see some familiar faces, to see my beloved cousin David and Elise and Stephanie, different people from around the country. I want to give Rochelle Ampersand a closing word as our honoree today and as a poet herself. Rochelle?
Oh, how can we make you not retire? Wonderful. One of the things that you didn't mention about me was that I never entered a synagogue until I was in my mid-40s. So I was bereft of a Jewish education and any understanding. And when I first read this poem, the thing that flashed for me was the Unetana Tokef, because this psalm was about another way of being dead while you were alive. And that certainly is what depression is all about. When you fall into the pit, things become concealed, and yet you know that you're in a world where things are known, but the ambiguity of what he attributes to God's affliction, this powerful God that visits upon him horrors, you want to know more, and this psalm doesn't answer it. It stays with the feeling of where he's at, and it's very difficult to just have that and not be able to climb out. So thank you, Rabbi, for your teaching.
Thank you, Rochelle. I'm honored to be able to honor you. And I leave your words as not needing any further words, just like this poem, as you point out, ends with the word choshech, with darkness, and pointing to light by virtue of the ability to be self-expressive and in relationship with God. The Utana Tokef, which you mentioned, will be part of Psalm 89 tomorrow, the third longest psalm. It took a long time to translate the 53 verses. We'll honor tomorrow Cantor Shula in celebration of her granddaughter's birth. To everybody, thank you. A great privilege to start my day with you. Be
Thank
well.
you.